They say your family is supposed to be your safe place, the people who catch you when you fall, who believe in you before anyone else does. That's what I grew up thinking, that's what I held onto for 29 years. But what do you do when the people who were supposed to catch you are the ones who let you drop and then blames you for hitting the ground? My name is Lydia. And this is the story of how my own parents decided I wasn't good enough, and how their biggest client proved them wrong. My family runs a mid-sized event planning and catering company out of Charleston, South Carolina. My parents built it from nothing, a folding table, a rented kitchen, and a list of contacts my mother kept in a spiral notebook. By the time I was in high school, Harlow and Associates was doing weddings, corporate retreats, charity galas, real events, real money. My mother ran operations, my father handled client relationships, and my older brother, Colton, was being groomed from the time he could shake a hand and look someone in the eye. I knew from the time I was 16 that I wanted to be part of it. Not because they pressured me. Honestly, no one asked, I just loved it. I loved the chaos of setup day, the way a plain hotel ballroom could become something that made people cry happy tears. I went to school for hospitality management at the College of Charleston. I interned with the top event firm in Atlanta my junior year. I came home with ideas, with contacts, with a whole new understanding of how to modernize what my parents had built. I came home ready. What I didn't know was that the decision had already been made. It just hadn't been announced yet. My first year back, I worked every event we had. I was on-site coordinator for a 400-person corporate gala for a pharmaceutical company out of Colombia. I redesigned our vendor intake process, cutting setup costs by almost 18%. I brought in a new audiovisual partner that my father had dismissed as too expensive, and then watched as that same partnership saved the rehearsal dinner when our old vendor canceled 48 hours out. My mother noticed. She told me once, standing in our commercial kitchen at 11 at night after a wedding, "You've got a real eye for this, Lydia." I held on to that sentence for years. I wrote it down in a journal. I thought it meant something. What I didn't see, what I refused to see, was that noticing and deciding are two very different things. The summer I turned 28, my parents sat me and Colton down at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon. My father had his reading glasses on even though there was nothing to read. My mother kept her hands folded in her lap. Colton had driven down from Charlotte for the weekend, which I thought was just a family visit. It wasn't. My father said they were beginning a transition plan. He said Colton would be stepping into the role of general manager, taking over day-to-day operations and client relations. He said this was what made sense for the company's future. He said a lot of things. What he didn't say, not directly, was where I fit into any of it. I remember keeping my voice very level, because I knew if I let it shake, they would see that as proof of exactly what they already believed about me. My mother was the one who answered. She said I was wonderful with details. She said I had a great instinct for execution. But leadership, she said, the big picture, the client relationships, the high-stakes decisions, that required a certain kind of confidence, a certain kind of presence. She looked at Colton when she said it. She didn't look at me. My father added that I was young, that there was time, that this wasn't a permanent decision. He said, "We just think, and for now, and you understand." He used every soft phrase people use when they've already made a hard choice and don't want to own it. I sat there and I nodded. I said I understood. I didn't cry until I was in my car. Here's what I want you to understand about the next 8 months, because this part matters. I stayed. I kept showing up. I kept working. Colton moved back to Charleston and stepped into the GM role like he'd been born to it, which, in my parents' eyes, maybe he had. He was charming with clients. He was good in a room. What he wasn't good at was the actual work that happened before the room mattered. He didn't know our vendor contracts. He didn't know why we used linen supplier B instead of supplier A, or why the florist on Broad Street got paid net 15 when everyone else was net 30. He didn't know, because he'd never done the work of knowing. He'd been in Charlotte selling commercial real estate for 6 years while I was here, inside this company, learning every single moving part of it. So he asked me. Every day, he asked me, what's the protocol for this? Who do we call for that? Where's the file for the Henderson account? What did we charge the Rosenthal family last spring? I answered every time. I pulled the files. I explained the reasoning. I walked him through decisions that I had originally made and documented, watching him take notes in his leather portfolio like he was discovering all of it for the first time. And then I watched him present those things to my parents and our team as his own thinking. There was one moment that I still think about. We had a potential new client, a regional bank, Palmetto First, looking for a firm to handle their annual leadership conference, about 250 people. 2 days, high-end accommodations. This was a significant account. My father had a relationship with their VP of marketing, a man named Arthur, and had gotten us in the door for a pitch meeting. I spent 3 weeks on that proposal. I researched their brand identity, their past conference feedback on LinkedIn, their CEO's public statements about company culture. I built a full event concept with tiered pricing, a run of show vendor recommendations, even a contingency plan for weather since we'd be doing an outdoor reception component. I stayed at the office until midnight twice. I formatted every page. The morning of the pitch, Colton picked up the binder from my desk, flicked through it for about 4 minutes, and walked into that conference room. I was not invited. My father said the client had specifically asked for a smaller meeting, just 2 or 3 people from our leadership team. He said my name wasn't on their list. I stood in the parking lot of our office building and watched my brother carry my work through those glass doors. We got the Palmetto First account. My parents were thrilled. My father clapped Colton on the shoulder that evening and said he'd done a hell of a job. Colton smiled. He didn't look at me. I wish I could say there was one dramatic moment that made me decide to leave. There wasn't. It was quieter than that. It was smaller. It was my mother asking Colton's opinion on a vendor dispute I had already resolved. It was my father CCing Colton on an email that had originally been sent to me. It was sitting in a planning meeting and having my suggestion interrupted. Then hearing Colton say the same thing 3 minutes later and watching my father write it down. Death by 1,000 small erasures. I started keeping records. Not out of anger. Or not only out of anger. Out of clarity. I documented what I had built, the processes, the templates, the client notes I had written by hand and then digitized, the relationships I had cultivated, the vendors I had negotiated with, the systems I had designed. I wasn't building a case. I was just making sure I could remember who I was, because it was getting harder to hold on to that inside that building. I started applying for jobs in February, quietly, mostly boutique event firms in other cities. Nashville, Washington, D.C., Atlanta again. I had 2 second-round interviews. I didn't tell anyone. And then something happened that I did not see coming. Her name was Donna Ashworth. She was the director of events and partnerships at a private equity firm called Meridian Group, based out of Charlotte. Meridian Group was one of our client relationships, not mine officially, because nothing was mine officially anymore, but I had been the one managing their account for nearly 2 years. Annual investor dinner, 200 people, black tie, always at the Belmont Charleston Place Hotel. I knew Donna's assistant's name, her dietary restrictions, her preference for white hydrangeas over any other flower. The fact that she liked the podium moved 6 inches left of center because of a lighting issue she'd mentioned once and never had to mention again. Donna called the main office line one afternoon in March. Colton took the call. I wasn't in the room, but our office manager Tess was, and she told me what happened afterward, almost word for word. Donna had questions about the upcoming investor dinner. She had a new component she wanted to add, a private pre-dinner reception for 12 people, board members and key LPs, Something very different from the main event, more intimate, with a specific aesthetic she was trying to achieve. She described what she had in mind. Colton told her they could absolutely make it happen, and asked her to send her notes in an email so he could review and follow up. Donna paused. Then she asked, "Is Lydia available? I'd really prefer to work through the details with her directly." Colton said I was handling other projects, but that he would make sure everything got communicated. Donna said, "All right, but please have her call me." Tess pulled me into the hallway and told me this the same afternoon. I went back to my desk and waited for Colton to relay the message. He didn't. Not that day, not the next day either. On the third day, I came in early and saw the email chain on the shared drive, Donna's notes, forwarded to Colton, with a response drafted under his name that addressed maybe a third of what she'd actually asked about and completely missed the aesthetic vision she was describing. He was planning to send it that morning. I sat with that for a long time. Longer than I probably should have. Then I picked up my phone and called Donna directly. She answered on the second ring. I introduced myself, apologized for the delay, and said I'd seen her notes and wanted to talk through the pre-reception concept before we moved forward on anything. She said, "Lydia, finally. Yes, let's talk." We were on the phone for 45 minutes. I asked her about the 12 board members, who they were, what their relationship to each other was, what tone she wanted to set before the main dinner. She wanted something that felt almost residential, she said. Like being invited into someone's home, not into a hotel. Warm lighting, no visible event infrastructure, food that felt hand-prepared and personal rather than catered. I understood exactly what she meant. I had a vendor in mind before we even finished the call. A private chef I'd worked with for a rehearsal dinner 2 years ago who specialized in exactly that kind of experience. I had a space in mind too. A townhouse rental on East Bay Street that I'd scouted for a previous client and kept in my notes. Donna went quiet for a moment after I described the concept. Then she said, "I need to be honest with you about something." I told her to go ahead. She said Meridian Group had been evaluating their vendor relationships ahead of the new fiscal year. She said she championed Harlow and Associates internally because of the quality of work on the account. "Your quality of work," she said specifically. She said some of the things she'd encountered recently had given her pause. And then she said something that I wasn't expecting. She said she'd been authorized to offer a contract directly, not to the company, but to whoever was managing her account. She said Meridian Group was launching a new hospitality and events division to handle and partner events going forward, and they were looking for someone to lead it. She'd mentioned my name to their head of operations 2 weeks ago. I sat very still. She said, "I don't know what's going on over there, Lydia, but I know good work when I see it. And I know the difference between a person who cares about what they're doing and a person who's just moving files around." I asked her what the position would look like. She told me. It was a full-time director role in-house at Meridian, based in Charlotte. Benefits, equity stake in the new division, a budget and a small team. It was, there is no other word for it, everything. Everything I had been building toward without being allowed to build toward it. I told her I needed a few days to think. She said she understood. She also said that the email Colton had been about to send would have been a problem, and she was glad I'd called first. I didn't tell my parents right away. I know some people would have walked into that building and laid it all out on the table the same afternoon. But I am my mother's daughter in at least one way. I don't move until I'm sure. I spent 4 days doing nothing dramatic. I reviewed my employment agreement. I didn't have a non-compete clause because my parents had never imagined I'd be the one to leave. I talked to a friend who worked in HR and asked general questions without specifics. I reviewed every piece of documentation I had saved. Then I called Donna back and said yes. I gave my notice on a Thursday. I wrote a 2-week resignation letter, professional and brief. I put it on my father's desk before he arrived. He called me into his office 40 minutes later. My mother came in behind him and closed the door. My father asked if this was about the gym decision. I said the gym decision was part of it, but it wasn't the only part. My mother asked where I was going. I told her I'd accepted a director role with a client. There was a silence that had a shape to it. I could feel them working through the implications. Donna, Meridian Group. The investor dinner that was 8 weeks away. My father said, "You're going to a client." I said yes. He said that felt like a betrayal. I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about the Sunday afternoon at the kitchen table. I thought about the pitch meeting I hadn't been invited to. I thought about Coulton's leather portfolio, full of my thinking. I said, "I understand why you'd feel that way." I didn't apologize. My last 2 weeks were quieter than I expected. Coulton avoided me mostly, which was fine. My mother asked once if I was sure. I said yes. My father didn't ask again. Tess cried a little on my last day and gave me a card signed by the office staff. I kept it. I moved to Charlotte in April. Meridian Group gave me a moving stipend, which I did not tell my parents about. The hospitality division took 6 months to build properly. I hired 3 people, a coordinator, a logistics specialist, and an assistant who reminded me of myself at 24, which I told her and which embarrassed her. We did 11 events in our first 8 months of operation. 11 events with 0 vendor failures, 0 client complaints, and a net promoter score from internal stakeholders that their head of operations called frankly alarming in how high it is. Donna sent me a bottle of champagne after the investor dinner. The note said, "This is why I asked for you." I heard through Tess, who texted me sometimes carefully, the way people do when they're loyal to someone but also still employed somewhere else, that the Palmetto First Conference had some issues, not catastrophic, just the kind of slow grinding friction that happens when the person managing an account doesn't actually understand the account. A vendor miscommunication that cost them a day of setup time. A dietary accommodation missed for 3 guests at a board dinner. Small things. The kind of small things I had spent years making sure never happened. I also heard that Palmetto First had started asking questions about their contract renewal. I don't know what happened after that. I stopped asking. My mother called me on a Sunday in November. It was the first time we'd spoken since a brief, strained call in July. She asked how I was. I said I was well. She asked about Charlotte, about the job. I told her it was going well. She said that was good. She said she was glad I was happy. Then she said your father and I talked. We think we may have underestimated some things. I waited. She didn't say more than that. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe that was as far as she could get right then, and I decided to let it be enough. Not because it erased anything. It didn't. But because she called, and she said it, and sometimes that's the first step toward a conversation that might take years to have fully. I said, "I know, Mom." She asked if we could have dinner sometime when I was in Charleston. I said yes. Here's what I know now that I didn't know 2 years ago. The people who underestimate you are not always your enemies. Sometimes they are people who love you in the limited way they know how to love, who built something with their hands and got so attached to their picture of how it should continue that they couldn't see what was right in front of them. That doesn't make what they did right. It doesn't undo the proposals you wrote that someone else presented, or the meetings you weren't invited to, or the Sunday afternoon when someone looked at your brother instead of you when they talked about confidence. But it makes it possible to sit across from them at the dinner table someday. Maybe not yet, maybe not for a while, but someday. What I also know is this: no one can take credit for what you actually know. They can take the binder, they can take the client meeting, they can take the title and the parking spot and the Sunday afternoon announcement, but they cannot take the thing inside you that made all of it possible. That part travels with you. Donna knew who built that account, the vendors knew, Tess knew, and eventually the work itself told the truth, the way it always does if you give it enough time. Someone asked me recently if I was angry. I thought about it honestly. I was, I said, for a long time. And now? I looked at the Charlotte skyline from my office window. I thought about 11 events, about a team I'd built from scratch, about a bottle of champagne and a note that said, "This is why I ask for you." Now, I said, "I'm just busy." I spent a lot of time thinking about what actually happened, not the version I tell at dinner parties, not the clean narrative I've gotten better at delivering, but the real thing. The way it felt to sit at that kitchen table and hear my parents talk about the future of a company I had quietly held together, and realize that neither of them had looked at me when they said the word leadership. There's a cause and effects to everything, even the things that hurt. My parents made a decision based on what they could see, and what they could see was Colton. Older, a man, someone who looked the part in a room. What they couldn't see was the 18% I'd cut from vendor costs, or the florist I'd called at 7 in the morning to salvage a rehearsal dinner, or the 3 weeks I'd spent building a proposal that walked into a pitch meeting inside my brother's hands. They didn't see it because they weren't looking. And because they weren't looking, they lost the one person who was actually doing the work. That's not karma in any mystical sense. That's just how accountability moves through time. Every choice lands somewhere. Colton took credit for things he didn't build, and when it was time to maintain them, the cracks showed. The interior accommodations missed. Vendors confused. A client starting to ask questions about the renewal. Not because Colton was a bad person, I don't think he is, but because you cannot fake competence indefinitely. The gap between what you've actually learned and what you've claimed to know will always find a way to surface. What I'm most proud of isn't that I got the job with Meridian. It's that I didn't become someone I didn't recognize in the process of leaving. I was angry, genuinely, bone-deep angry, and I had every right to be, but I didn't blow up the office on my way out. I didn't send the email I wrote and deleted 3 times. I kept my records, I gave my notice, I wrote a professional letter, and I walked out with my integrity completely intact. That mattered to me then, and it matters to me now. Donna didn't call me because I was lucky. She called me because for 2 years I had answered every question she had before she finished asking it. I had remembered the podium, the hydrangeas, the dietary note she mentioned once and never repeated. Integrity isn't just about the big moments. It's about the small invisible ones, the ones where no one's watching and you do it right anyway. That's what Donna was paying attention to, even when I didn't know she was. I think about what I'd say to myself sitting in that parking lot watching Colton carry my binder through those glass doors. I'd say, the work knows who made it. Not today, maybe not for months, but the work always tells the truth eventually. And I'd say, don't shrink to make them more comfortable. The worst thing I almost did was make myself smaller so my family wouldn't have to reckon with what they'd done. That impulse to smooth things over, to keep the peace to stay, would have cost me everything Meridian became. Be ethical, even when it's not rewarded. Be smart enough to document and plan and know your worth. And be resilient enough to keep going on the days when you're not sure the truth will ever catch up. It does. It just moves at its own pace,